All right, Chris, thank you. In just 2 hours, the state of Indiana will put Roy Lee Ward to death.
Ward was convicted of the rape and murder of a teenage girl in southern Indiana 24 years ago, and he's been on Indiana's death row ever since. CBS 4's Russ McQuaid shows us what more from outside the state prison in Michigan City.
Opponents of capital punishment gathered to pray and protest against the execution of Roy Lee Ward here in the parking lot outside the gates of the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. Roy Lee Ward's final sunset at the Indiana State Prison was quiet, as authorities typically lock down the facility the night of an execution. Ward was convicted in 2002 of the murder the previous summer of 15-year-old Stacy Payne. She was mortally slashed inside the family home in Dale, Indiana, while her parents were gone, and her little sister frantically called 911 from inside the parents' bedroom. When police arrived, they found Ward in the front hallway with a bloody knife, his victim in the kitchen, her throat cut and unable to talk. Ward was found guilty, sentenced to death, given a new trial, and pleaded guilty on his own.
In the early morning hours of October 10, 2025, inside Indiana State Prison at Michigan City, Roy Lee Ward lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 12:33 a.m., the state of Indiana carried out his execution by lethal injection. He was 53 years old, the third person executed in Indiana since the state resumed capital punishment after a 15-year pause, and a man whose case had consumed more than 2 decades of legal proceedings. The tragedy was compounded by time. Ward had committed his crime at age 29, already carrying a record of more than 50 prior convictions across 3 states. For 24 years, he lived under sentence of death, his case winding through 2 separate trials, multiple appeals that questioned pretrial publicity, and a late diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder that his attorneys argued explained a lifetime of misunderstood behavior. Yet none of those arguments erased the crime that had sealed his fate: the brutal rape and murder of 15-year-old Stacy Payne in her own home. As the pentobarbital entered his system, Deacon Brian Nosbush held Ward's hand. Witnesses reported Ward closed his eyes, and within minutes his hand turned blue before stillness came. Ward had prepared final words expressing remorse, but the execution proceeded before they could be read aloud. A final failure of communication for a man whose inability to express himself had marked his entire life. Ward's journey from troubled child to condemned man made him unique in Indiana criminal justice history. He was the only death row inmate to receive death sentences from 2 separate juries in 2 different counties. His first conviction was overturned by the Indiana Supreme Court due to pervasive pretrial publicity that had saturated Spencer County. But even with a fresh jury from another county, the outcome remained the same. Both juries heard the evidence and reached identical conclusions about what Roy Lee Ward deserved. His crime had left an entire community traumatized. A teenage girl, home alone with her younger sister, a man who cut phone lines before knocking on the door with a story about a lost dog, an attack so violent that first responders would call it the worst scene they had ever encountered. Stacy Payne died hours after the assault, conscious throughout her ordeal, unable to speak because of her injuries. Her 14-year-old sister witnessed the attack and made the 911 call that brought help too late. But to understand how a repeat offender with decades of criminal history became the face of Indiana's return to executions, how the justice system's ability to protect communities from dangerous predators, and whether the death penalty serves justice or simply closes a chapter that was written in tragedy, we have to go back. Back to July 11, 2001. Back to a quiet Wednesday morning in Dale, Indiana. Back to the moment when Roy Lee Ward knocked on the Payne family's door and Stacy Payne opened it. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, the darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Roy Lee Ward was born on July 20th, 1972, entering a world that would never quite make sense to him. His parents' marriage showed cracks from the beginning. The instability at home created an environment where Ward struggled to form healthy attachments. His parents separated when he was young, divorcing entirely before he reached adolescence. The pattern of his childhood, moving between households, lacking consistent structure, and witnessing adult conflicts he couldn't process, shaped the trajectory of everything that followed. Ward's early years revealed signs that concerned teachers and neighbors. He had difficulty reading social cues. Other children avoided him. His communication style seemed off in ways that adults noticed but couldn't quite define. In the 1970s and 1980s, schools in rural Indiana lacked resources to identify developmental disorders. Ward fell through the gaps, labeled simply as a problem child, rather than someone who needed specialized support. By his teenage years, Ward's behavior had escalated beyond typical adolescent rebellion. His juvenile record began accumulating charges for public indecency and harassment. These weren't one-time mistakes, but repeated incidents that showed a pattern. The juvenile justice system tried probation. Ward failed. Counseling was suggested but never followed through consistently. Each intervention fell short, and Ward aged into adulthood carrying unresolved issues that would only intensify. At 18, Ward's adult criminal record began in 1990. Battery charges appeared first, physical altercations that landed him in court. Then came theft, forgery, and burglary. The early convictions in Indiana resulted in his first prison sentence with the Indiana Department of Corrections. He served time, was released, and within months faced new charges. Ward learned the system from the inside, which counties had lighter sentences, which judges showed leniency, how to negotiate plea deals that kept him out of prison or reduced his time. The most concerning pattern involved sexual offenses that emerged early and never stopped. Ward accumulated public indecency charges at an alarming rate. Between 1990 and 2001, he would be convicted of indecent exposure and public indecency more than 25 times. The incidents followed a similar pattern. Ward would approach public areas, parks, parking lots, residential neighborhoods, and expose himself to women or teenage girls. Victims reported feeling violated and afraid. Ward would often flee before police arrived, but officers eventually caught him. Each time he received relatively light sentences: probation, short jail stays, or fines. Ward's crimes weren't limited to one jurisdiction. He moved between Indiana, Kentucky, and Missouri, each state adding charges to his file. Kentucky authorities began recognizing his name after multiple harassment complaints and indecent exposure incidents. Officers would see Ward in their communities and watch him, waiting for the next offense. But resources didn't exist to monitor him constantly, and Ward learned to move on before building too extensive a record in any single jurisdiction. Missouri became Ward's next stop in the late 1990s. Cooper County authorities arrested him for burglary, a significant escalation from his usual pattern of sexual offenses and minor property crimes. The court sentenced him to probation with conditions, regular check-ins, maintaining employment, staying out of trouble. Ward violated these conditions repeatedly, but somehow avoided prison. His probation officer noted in reports that Ward seemed incapable of following even basic rules. He missed appointments, failed to verify employment, and continued accumulating charges in other states while supposedly under supervision. Perry County, Indiana placed Ward on probation for another felony conviction. The nature of that conviction remained sealed in some records, but court documents confirmed he was serving probation terms when he committed his final crime. The Perry County Probation Department, like others before it, struggled to maintain contact with Ward. He moved frequently, often leaving no forwarding address. When officers tried to reach him for mandatory meetings, Ward would claim he hadn't received notices or would simply fail to appear. Ward's family life reflected his chaos. Relationships failed. Employment never lasted long. He drifted between cheap apartments and sometimes lived out of his car. His mother tried to maintain contact, hoping her son would find stability. But Ward's problems ran deeper than family support could address. He told some people he wanted help, but never followed through with treatment programs. Mental health evaluations ordered by various courts documented Ward's disorders over the years. One evaluation diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, suggesting he lacked empathy and disregarded social norms. Another focused on his exhibitionism disorder, the clinical term for his compulsive exposure behavior, recommending treatment that Ward never completed. The volume of Ward's offenses was staggering. More than 50 total convictions by age 29 represented an average of more than 2 convictions per year since he turned 18. By 2001, Ward had outstanding warrants in multiple jurisdictions. Check deception charges waited in at least one county. He owed fines and restitution from previous convictions that he had never paid. Technically, any law enforcement officer could have arrested him on these warrants and held him while courts sorted out his status. But warrants for nonviolent offenses often sat in databases without active pursuit, and Ward knew this. He moved through communities, staying under the radar just enough to avoid immediate arrest. Spencer County became his latest stop, a quiet place where Ward believed he could continue his pattern without significant consequences. The small communities scattered across the county lacked the law enforcement resources of larger cities. Probation departments were understaffed. Mental health services were limited. It was exactly the kind of place where someone like Ward could operate, at least for a while. While Ward drifted through the Midwest, leaving victims in his wake, 15-year-old Stacey Payne was building the kind of life that represented everything Ward had never achieved: stability, connection, achievement, and hope for the future. The distance between their worlds seemed infinite, but that distance was closing in ways neither could have imagined. The system's failures had created a dangerous man, and those failures were about to have devastating consequences for a family that had done nothing to deserve what was coming. Stacey Lynn Payne was growing up in Dale, Indiana, surrounded by the kind of stable family environment Ward had never known. Born on February 24, 1986, Stacey entered a world fundamentally different from the one that had shaped Ward's troubled life. Bill and Julie Payne provided their daughter with structure, love, and consistent support. The very things Ward's childhood had lacked. The Paynes gave their children opportunities to build lives they could be proud of. Stacey embraced these opportunities with enthusiasm that marked her personality from an early age. While Ward was accumulating his 10th, 20th, then 25th conviction, Stacey was earning grades, making friends, and developing into the kind of teenager every parent hoped to raise. Heritage Hills High School became Stacey's second home. She threw herself into school activities with dedication. The cheerleading squad claimed her afternoons and many weekends. Stacey learned routines, practiced stunts, and performed at football and basketball games. Her teammates remember her positive attitude and willingness to help others master difficult moves. Cheerleading taught her discipline and teamwork, lessons that extended beyond the gym floor. Academics came naturally to Stacey. Teachers recognized her intelligence and work ethic. She maintained honor roll status throughout high school, balancing homework with extracurricular activities without letting either suffer. Her organizational skills impressed adults who worked with her. Stacey kept detailed schedules, completed assignments ahead of deadlines, and helped classmates who struggled with material she found easier. The school band added another dimension to Stacey's life. She participated in rehearsals and performances, contributing to the musical programs that Heritage Hills offered. Friends from band described Stacey as someone who made practice sessions enjoyable, even when learning difficult pieces. Her favorite song, "You Are My Sunshine," captured the warmth she brought to relationships. People remembered that about her, how she made others feel welcome and valued. Student council work showed Stacey's leadership potential. She served as a representative for her class, attending meetings and bringing concerns from fellow students to faculty attention. The responsibilities required maturity and communication skills that Stacey developed naturally. Teachers suggested she might pursue public service or education after graduation. Stacey hadn't decided on specific career plans, but knew she wanted to make a positive difference in whatever field she chose. Outside organized activities, Stacy maintained close friendships. She spent time at friends' homes, attended movies, and participated in the informal social networks that connected Dale teenagers. Her parents appreciated that Stacy chose friends who shared her values. Julie Payne knew her daughter's friend group and felt confident in the decisions Stacy made about who to spend time with. The summer of 2001 marked a transition for Stacy. At 15, she stood between childhood and young adulthood, gaining independence while still living at home. She had secured her first real job at Jenks Pizza, a local restaurant where many Dale teenagers worked their first positions. The job taught her responsibility, showing up on time, following a schedule, managing money she earned herself. Stacy saved her paychecks, planning for future needs while allowing herself small purchases that came from her own work. Her younger sister Melissa looked up to Stacy. The age gap meant they weren't competing for the same social circles, and their relationship carried genuine affection. Melissa saw in her older sister an example of what high school success looked like. July 11th, 2001 started as an ordinary Wednesday for Stacy. School was out for summer. She had a shift scheduled at Jenks Pizza that afternoon. Her plan involved spending the morning at home, preparing for work, and leaving in early afternoon. Melissa was there, napping upstairs during the quiet hours before Stacy needed to leave. Their parents had already departed for their jobs, trusting their daughters in the safe home that had always protected them. But safety in Dale was about to be tested. Roy Lee Ward had made his way to Spencer County, his decades of offending finally converging on this quiet community. Nothing about that Wednesday morning suggested it would be anything other than routine. Stacy had no way of knowing that the dangerous pattern Ward represented was about to intersect with her life in the most devastating way possible. The two worlds, Ward's chaos and Stacy's promise, were about to collide, and only one would survive the encounter. Before approaching the house, Ward attempted to cut the telephone lines outside. Evidence at the scene showed damage to the phone line, indicating his intent to prevent anyone from calling for help. Around noon, Ward knocked on the front door. When Stacy answered, he told her he was looking for a lost dog. He asked if she had seen it in the neighborhood, if he could check the backyard. The story seemed reasonable enough. In rural Indiana, dogs wandered off regularly. Neighbors helped each other search. Dale was the kind of place where people trusted strangers with simple requests. Stacy, raised in this environment of community trust, agreed to let Ward look around the property. Once inside, Ward's true intentions became clear. He produced a knife he had brought with him, another element of premeditation that prosecutors would emphasize. Stacy realized too late that she was in danger. The attack began in the living area of the home. Stacy fought back. She was athletic from cheerleading, strong for her age, but Ward was a grown man, and he had the element of surprise. Ward struck Stacy repeatedly with a 5-pound dumbbell he found in the home. The medical examiner would later document 18 separate blunt force injuries across her head, face, and body. Each strike was delivered with enough force to cause severe trauma. The attack was not quick or merciful. It was sustained and brutal. The number of blows indicated Ward's intent to incapacitate his victim completely. The sexual assault occurred while Stacy was severely injured, but still conscious. Court documents confirm the rape but spare explicit details out of respect for the victim and her family. What matters is that Ward assaulted a 15-year-old girl who was already gravely wounded and unable to defend herself. This element of the crime, attacking someone already helpless, would become a key aggravating factor in the death penalty phase. Ward then used the knife he had brought to inflict additional injuries. He cut Stacy's throat deeply, severing structures that allowed her to speak. The medical examiner testified that this injury prevented Stacy from being able to call for help or communicate verbally, though she remained conscious. The injury caused severe bleeding and made breathing extremely difficult. Ward also cut into Stacy's abdomen with enough force that her intestines became exposed. The wound was so deep that the medical examiner noted the spinal cord was nearly severed. Upstairs, Melissa had been sleeping. The sound of her sister's screams woke her. She rushed to the top of the stairs and looked down into the living area below. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Roy Lee Ward was on top of her sister. Stacy was screaming, though the sound was distorted by her throat injuries. Melissa heard her sister pleading, "Please stop, please stop." Melissa was 14 years old, alone in a house with an attacker and her severely wounded sister. Her response showed a remarkable presence of mind under circumstances of pure terror. She ran to her parents' bedroom where the phone was located. Her hands shook as she picked up the receiver and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Melissa reported that a man was in her house hurting her sister. The dispatcher tried to keep Melissa on the line, asking questions about what was happening. Through the phone, the dispatcher could hear sounds from downstairs. Melissa could still hear her sister's voice, still begging the attacker to stop. The dispatcher immediately sent law enforcement to the Payne residence. Daletown Marshal Matt Keller received the call while at Heritage Hills High School discussing security plans for an upcoming event. The initial information suggested a home invasion or domestic situation. Keller drove to the address, his mind processing possibilities and planning his approach. Keller arrived at the Payne home within minutes of the 911 call. As he approached, he saw Roy Lee Ward standing in the doorway of the house. Ward was holding a knife in his hand. His clothing was soaked with perspiration. Blood covered his hands, arms, and shirt. The amount of blood indicated significant violence had occurred inside. Keller drew his service weapon and ordered Ward to the ground. Ward complied, without resistance. He dropped the knife and lay face down on the ground. Keller handcuffed him quickly, then asked what had happened. Ward's response was simply, "I didn't do anything." Keller secured Ward and then entered the house to check on the victim. What Keller found in the kitchen required him to draw on his emergency medical training to maintain composure. Stacy Payne lay on the floor. She was unclothed from the waist down. Blood pooled around her. The injuries to her throat and abdomen were immediately visible. Her intestines were exposed. The scene was one of extreme violence. Keller knelt beside Stacy and identified himself as a police officer. He told her that help was coming, that she needed to hold on. Stacy's eyes were open. She was conscious and aware of his presence. The throat injury prevented her from speaking, but Keller could see she was trying to breathe, struggling with each breath. Her eyes showed she understood what he was saying. She knew she had been severely injured. She knew she was in danger of dying. Keller immediately called for medical assistance and additional law enforcement. The severity of Stacy's injuries meant she needed helicopter transport to a trauma center. Every minute counted. While waiting for paramedics, Keller did what he could to provide comfort and reassurance, though he knew from his training that her injuries were likely unsurvivable. Spencer County paramedics Jane and Murray Stout arrived quickly. Both were experienced emergency medical providers, but what they found at the Payne home was beyond anything they had encountered in their careers. The medical team stabilized Stacy as much as possible for transport. An air ambulance was called from Evansville, the nearest city with a trauma center capable of handling her injuries. The helicopter landed near the Payne home. The medical flight crew transferred Stacy to the aircraft and flew her to the hospital in Evansville. At the hospital, trauma surgeons worked for hours trying to save Stacy's life. They addressed the bleeding, repaired what could be repaired, and fought to keep her alive. But the damage was too extensive. The blood loss had been massive. The injuries to vital organs and structures were beyond surgical correction. Multiple systems were failing. Stacy Payne died that afternoon, several hours after Roy Lee Ward attacked her in her own home. Back at the Payne residence, law enforcement had secured the scene. Ward sat handcuffed in a patrol car, his clothing and hands covered in Stacy's blood. Indiana State Police investigators Randy Tutrell and R4pist arrived to assist Dale's small police force with what was now clearly a major crime scene. Melissa was with a neighbor, having witnessed her sister's attack and now waiting to learn if Stacy would survive. The evidence collection began. The knife Ward had been holding was photographed and secured. His clothing was taken for forensic analysis. The house was processed methodically. Photographs of every room, documentation of blood patterns, collection of physical evidence. The severed telephone line was photographed and documented. The dumbbell used in the attack was located and secured. Every element of the crime scene was preserved for the legal proceedings that would follow. Ward was transported to the Spencer County Jail. He was booked on preliminary charges while investigators waited to learn if Stacy would survive. When news came that she had died, the charges would be upgraded to murder. The murder of Stacy Payne shattered Dale's sense of security. Within hours of the attack, news spread through the community via phone calls and conversations at local businesses. By nightfall, everyone in Spencer County knew what had happened. The question on every resident's mind was simple but troubling. How could this happen here? Before we continue, if you're finding this deep dive into the Roy Lee Ward case informative, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue producing thoroughly researched true crime documentaries that examine every aspect of these complex cases. Let's continue. Local newspapers published their first coverage on July 12th. The Spencer County Journal-Democrat ran a front-page story with the headline detailing the brutal attack. The Ferdinand News, serving nearby communities, covered the story with similar prominence. The articles described the basic facts: a 15-year-old girl attacked in her home, a man arrested at the scene, a community in mourning. The reporting was graphic enough to convey the severity of what had occurred, while avoiding details too disturbing for a family newspaper. Television stations from Evansville sent crews to Dale. Local affiliates for major networks set up cameras outside the Payne residence, at the county courthouse, and on Dale's main street. Reporters interviewed residents who expressed shock and grief. The footage showed a quiet town thrust into unwanted spotlight, its residents struggling to process what had happened to one of their own. The coverage intensified when reporters discovered Roy Lee Ward's criminal history. Social conversations in Spencer County took on darker tones. Residents who had never locked their doors during the day began securing their homes. Parents restricted their children's activities, no longer comfortable with the freedom that small-town life had always afforded. The sense that Dale was somehow protected from urban violence had been destroyed, and residents struggled to adjust to their new reality. Stacy's funeral drew approximately 500 mourners. Heritage Hills High School students attended in large numbers, many wearing their cheerleading uniforms or band attire to honor their classmate. Teachers, neighbors, and community members filled the church. The service focused on celebrating Stacy's life, her achievements, her kindness, her potential. But underlying every tribute was the unspoken reality that her life had been stolen by senseless violence. The Payne family requested privacy as they grieved, but they also made clear their expectations for justice. Through statements read by family friends, they expressed their desire for Ward to face the death penalty. They wanted the community to know that nothing less than the ultimate punishment would be appropriate for what had been done to their daughter. Media coverage showed no signs of diminishing as summer turned to fall. Every development in the case generated new stories. Ward's court appearances, even brief procedural hearings, attracted reporters. The defense team's motions were reported and analyzed. The prosecution's strategy became a topic of public discussion. Spencer County residents consumed this coverage, their anger at Ward growing with each new revelation about his past. This saturation coverage would become a central issue in the case. Defense attorneys argued that extensive pretrial publicity had made a fair trial impossible in Spencer County. They documented every newspaper article, every television story, every radio report. The evidence they compiled would eventually convince the Indiana Supreme Court that the community's exposure to information about Ward had created bias that could not be overcome through normal jury selection procedures. But in the summer and fall of 2001, as coverage continued unabated, the immediate concern was preparing for a trial that would test whether justice could be served in a community so deeply affected by the crime. Jury selection for Roy Lee Ward's first trial began in October 2002, 15 months after the murder. Despite defense motions for a change of venue due to extensive pretrial publicity, Judge Wayne Rawle denied the requests, believing careful jury selection could identify impartial jurors. A 28-page questionnaire revealed severe problems. Of 122 prospective jurors who completed it, 101 had knowledge about the case, and 84 had already formed beliefs about Ward's guilt. Some responses were extreme, with one juror suggesting Ward should be hung instantly. After 2 days of selection and exhausting all their challenges, the defense ended up with a jury where half the seated members had already expressed beliefs about Ward's guilt before trial. The trial moved quickly, with overwhelming evidence against Ward. Prosecutor John Dart presented Matt Keller's testimony about finding Ward at the scene, holding the knife and covered in blood, Melissa Payne's terrified 911 call, and forensic evidence comprehensively tying Ward to the crime. The defense couldn't dispute Ward's presence at the scene or explain away the physical evidence, so they focused on presenting mitigating factors about his troubled childhood and mental health issues for the penalty phase. The prosecution countered by highlighting Ward's extensive criminal history and the brutal nature of the crime as evidence of a dangerous pattern that had escalated to murder. On October 18, 2002, the jury unanimously found Ward guilty of first-degree murder, rape, and criminal deviant conduct. During the penalty phase, they weighed aggravating circumstances against mitigating factors and recommended death. Judge Rawle formally sentenced Ward to death on December 18, 2002, with additional consecutive 50-year sentences for the other convictions. Ward showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced and was transported to death row at Indiana State Prison. Indiana State Prison in Michigan City sits on the shore of Lake Michigan, a maximum security facility that has housed the state's death row since executions resumed in the modern era. Roy Ward arrived there in early 2003 to begin what he assumed would be the final chapter of his life. Death row at Michigan City consisted of single cells in a secure unit, separated from the general prison population. Ward's daily routine followed the strict structure common to death row facilities. Meals arrived at his cell through a slot in the door. Exercise occurred in small yards, alone or with one other inmate, for limited periods. Contact with other prisoners remained minimal by design. The isolation served multiple purposes: security, punishment, and practical management of inmates who had nothing to lose. Legal mail dominated Ward's communication with the outside world. His defense team, now focused on appellate work, sent documents requiring his review and signature. The automatic appeals process in capital cases meant Ward's conviction would be examined by multiple courts, regardless of whether he actively pursued appeals. Indiana law required this review to ensure death sentences met constitutional standards. Ward's mother moved to Michigan City to be closer to her son. She visited regularly, maintaining the family connection despite everything Ward had done. These visits occurred in controlled settings, with physical barriers between inmates and visitors. The conversations were monitored. For Ward's mother, the visits represented her continued hope that her son might find some peace before his execution, even if she couldn't change his fate. Ward's daily existence on death row was marked by mundane details rather than dramatic events. He ate meals, watched television, received mail, exercised when permitted, and slept in his cell. In June 2004, Ward's appeals reached a critical moment. The Indiana Supreme Court issued its decision on his direct appeal. The ruling would determine whether Ward's conviction and death sentence stood or whether the case would need to be retried. For Ward, the decision meant either proceeding toward execution or returning to Spencer County to face trial again. For the Payne family, it meant learning whether justice had been properly served or whether they would need to endure another trial. On June 30, 2004, the Indiana Supreme Court issued its decision reversing Roy Lee Ward's conviction and death sentence, ordering a new trial. Justice Rucker wrote the unanimous opinion that shocked the Payne family and frustrated law enforcement. Though legal observers recognized the court had identified significant constitutional problems with the original trial. The court's opening paragraph directly stated that while Ward had been convicted of brutal murder, the case should not have been tried in Spencer County due to community bias and pervasive pretrial publicity, and the record supported this contention. The court's analysis focused on two required elements for overturning a venue decision: prejudicial pretrial publicity and jurors' inability to render an impartial verdict. Regarding publicity, the court found that while much coverage accurately reported the crime's facts, several articles included inadmissible information about Ward's criminal history that clearly prejudiced potential jurors. The coverage was extensive across 25 newspaper articles and 15 television news stories in a county of only 20,400 people, creating saturation that reached nearly every potential juror. Most damaging was the jury questionnaire data, showing 101 of 122 prospective jurors reported knowledge about the case, with one noting you'd have to live under a rock not to have heard about it. The second element proved even more problematic, as 84 prospective jurors had formed beliefs about Ward's guilt before trial, with responses ranging from measured opinions to extreme statements like Ward should be hung instantly. The court found that half the seated jurors had expressed guilt beliefs on their questionnaires, yet voir dire examination remained perfunctory, simply asking if they could be fair without probing how they would actually set aside previously stated opinions. Judge Roll's denial of the venue change motion became the critical error, as the court ruled that when pretrial publicity and jury bias reach such documented levels, the trial must be moved or jurors brought from another county to protect constitutional rights. The Payne family reacted with disbelief and anger, feeling victimized again by a system that seemed more concerned with defendants' rights than justice for their daughter. The defense had admitted from the beginning that Ward killed Stacy, making the reversal seem like a technicality to laypeople who wanted Ward punished rather than released. Community reaction mirrored the family's frustration, with editorials questioning how someone caught at the scene with overwhelming evidence could have his conviction overturned on procedural grounds. The practical implications meant the Spencer County Prosecutor's Office would need months of negotiations with the defense team about venue, finding a willing county to host the expensive trial, and preparing witnesses, including Melissa, to testify again about the worst day of their lives. The decision established important precedent about pretrial publicity in capital cases, but for the Payne family, abstract legal principles provided no comfort as they faced years more waiting for justice. After the Indiana Supreme Court's reversal, Ward remained in custody, while prosecution and defense spent months negotiating where the retrial would occur. By November 2005, the sides had reached an impasse over venue selection, with the defense wanting a geographically distant county with less media exposure, while the prosecution preferred somewhere nearby for witness convenience. Ward's defense team offered to plead guilty if the death penalty was removed, a pragmatic acknowledgement they couldn't win on the facts. But the Spencer County prosecutor rejected this because the Payne family insisted on capital punishment. By December 2005, courts selected a venue with Clay County providing jurors and Vanderburgh County hosting the trial in its facilities. Judge Roll recused himself in December 2006 due to his involvement in the overturned first trial, and Judge Robert Pigman was appointed to bring fresh perspective. The defense team changed with new attorneys joining, and while they knew the physical evidence remained overwhelming, they hoped Clay County jurors would be more receptive to mitigating evidence about Ward's background and mental health. Melissa Payne faced the difficult prospect of testifying again, and Julie Payne expressed frustration with delays but remained committed to pursuing the death penalty rather than accepting any plea bargain. The retrial began in May 2007, nearly 6 years after the murder, but Ward surprised observers by pleading guilty to all charges rather than proceeding with a full trial. This strategic decision allowed the defense to skip the guilt phase and focus entirely on the penalty phase, hoping to persuade the jury to choose life imprisonment over death. Judge Pigman accepted the plea after confirming Ward understood he was waiving his rights to trial, confronting witnesses, and presenting a defense. The penalty phase became a battle between the prosecution's emphasis on the crime's brutality, Ward's extensive criminal history, and his probation status, versus the defense's presentation of his troubled childhood, mental health disorders, and argument that his issues had never been properly treated. Matt Keller testified again about the crime scene. Melissa's 911 call was played once more, and medical testimony detailed Stacy's consciousness during the attack. Julie Payne described the ongoing impact on their family, while Ward's attorneys chose not to put him on the stand, fearing his communication style and effect might alienate jurors rather than generate sympathy. On May 18, 2007, the Clay County jury still unanimously recommended death after finding aggravating circumstances outweighed mitigating factors, and Judge Pigman formally sentenced Ward on June 9, 2007, making him unique in Indiana history as the only death row inmate to receive death sentences from two separate juries in different counties. Ward's case then entered the lengthy appeals process characteristic of capital cases, with automatic review examining his conviction through multiple court levels, regardless of whether he actively pursued appeals. The Indiana Supreme Court heard his direct appeal in 2009, focusing on whether mitigating evidence was properly considered rather than the pretrial publicity issues that overturned the first conviction. And on April 7, 2009, Justice Frank Sullivan wrote an opinion affirming the conviction and death sentence. Ward's attorneys pursued post-conviction relief, arguing trial counsel was ineffective, but both trial and appellate courts rejected these claims, finding his attorneys had conducted reasonable investigations and presented substantial mitigating evidence that the jury simply found insufficient. By June 2012, Ward had exhausted state appeals, triggering an execution date of December 11, 2012. But his attorneys immediately sought federal relief. Chief Judge Richard Young granted a 90-day stay on December 4, 2012, just 1 week before execution, appointing federal public defenders to represent Ward in habeas corpus proceedings that consumed years of detailed petitions and hearings. The federal courts ultimately sided with the state, with the Seventh Circuit affirming denial of habeas relief on August 26, 2016, and the U.S. Supreme Court denying Ward's petition without comment. Indiana's death penalty existed in legal limbo throughout the 2010s. The state maintained death row at Michigan City, and courts continued sentencing defendants to death, but no executions occurred. The problem was practical rather than legal. Pharmaceutical companies had stopped selling drugs used for lethal injections, and Indiana couldn't obtain the necessary medications to carry out death sentences. The drug shortage resulted from concerted efforts by death penalty opponents. Pharmaceutical companies faced pressure from advocacy groups, and European manufacturers refused to sell their products for executions. States that used lethal injection found themselves unable to purchase the drugs they needed. Some states experimented with alternative drug combinations, sometimes with disastrous results that led to botched executions making headlines. Indiana law specified lethal injection as the only permitted execution method. The state couldn't switch to alternatives like electrocution or firing squad without legislation changing the law. So death row inmates at Michigan City existed in legal limbo, sentenced to death, but with no mechanism to carry out those sentences. Ward was one of approximately a dozen men in this situation, all awaiting an execution that seemed indefinitely postponed. The situation changed in late 2024. Indiana officials announced they had secured a supply of pentobarbital, the drug commonly used for lethal injections. The state refused to disclose the source of the drugs, protected by a 2017 secrecy law that prevented public identification of suppliers. This secrecy was intended to shield pharmaceutical companies from boycotts and protests, allowing them to sell execution drugs without facing public backlash. The cost of the drugs shocked some observers. Public records eventually revealed that Indiana had spent $1.175 million to acquire 4 doses of pentobarbital, Each dose cost approximately $75,000 to $300,000. In December 2024, Indiana carried out its first execution in 15 years. Joseph Corcoran, convicted of killing 4 people in 1997, was executed by lethal injection at Indiana State Prison. The execution proceeded without reported complications. Death penalty supporters in Indiana viewed it as justice delayed but finally served. Opponents criticized resuming executions after the long pause, arguing the pause should become permanent. Benjamin Ritchie became Indiana's second execution in May 2025. Ritchie had killed 4 people in an Indianapolis apartment in 2001, the same year Ward killed Stacey Payne. Ritchie's execution drew attention for concerning witness accounts. Several observers reported that Ritchie violently lifted his head and shoulders off the gurney during the execution process. These movements suggested the pentobarbital might not have been working as intended, raising questions about whether Ritchie experienced pain before death. The witness accounts from Ritchie's execution became ammunition for death penalty opponents and defense attorneys representing other death row inmates. The report suggested that pentobarbital, when used as a single drug execution method, might not render the condemned unconscious as quickly as intended. If consciousness persisted while the drug caused respiratory distress, the condemned could experience suffocation-like sensations before death, potentially constituting cruel and unusual punishment. Governor Mike Braun, who took office in January 2025, faced immediate questions about execution policy. The state had used 2 of its 4 pentobarbital doses for Corcoran and Ritchie. The remaining 2 doses were set to expire within months. Braun initially indicated the state would not immediately purchase more drugs, citing the high cost and short shelf life. His comments suggested Indiana might reconsider its execution policy. Lieutenant Governor Micah Beckwith, a conservative pastor, publicly advocated for firing squads as an alternative to lethal injection. Beckwith argued that firing squads would be cheaper and more reliable than pharmaceutical executions. His proposal drew mixed reactions. Some supported it as a practical solution, while others viewed it as barbaric and potentially more cruel than lethal injection. For Roy Lee Ward and the 4 other men remaining on Indiana's death row after Ritchie's execution, these debates had immediate relevance. Would Indiana continue executing inmates, or would budget concerns and drug availability force another pause? Would the state change its execution method? These questions meant Ward's future remained uncertain, even as his appeals had been exhausted. By mid-2025, Indiana officials confirmed they had acquired additional pentobarbital doses, sufficient to carry out more executions. The state remained tight-lipped about the source, cost, and exact quantity. What was clear was that Indiana intended to continue using the death penalty, that drugs were available, and that death row inmates who had exhausted appeals would soon face execution dates. Roy Lee Ward was next in line. In 2025, more than 2 decades after killing Stacey Payne, Roy Lee Ward received a diagnosis that his attorneys considered crucial new evidence: autism spectrum disorder. Mental health professionals evaluated Ward using modern assessment tools that hadn't been available or widely used when he first entered the criminal justice system in the 1990s. And the diagnosis explained patterns in his behavior that had been misinterpreted throughout his life, including his difficulty reading social cues, struggles with communication, and problems forming relationships. Ward's attorneys argued this was significant mitigating evidence that neither jury had considered, as both penalty phases had characterized Ward as having antisocial personality disorder, essentially labeling him a psychopath who lacked empathy and showed no remorse, which heavily influenced the jury's death penalty recommendations. The distinction between the 2 disorders proved central to the defense argument. People with antisocial personality disorder typically don't experience remorse or guilt for harming others because their lack of empathy is fundamental to the disorder, while people with autism can and do experience remorse and empathy, but struggle to express these feelings in ways others recognize due to verbal and nonverbal communication difficulties. Ward's attorneys gathered evidence showing he had written letters acknowledging his wrongs and told spiritual advisors he understood the harm he caused, but his flat affect and communication difficulties made these expressions seem insincere to evaluators who concluded he was a remorseless psychopath. The autism diagnosis also provided context for his criminal history of exhibitionism, as the repetitive nature of his offenses, apparent inability to learn from consequences, and difficulty understanding social boundaries were all consistent with autism spectrum disorder rather than someone consciously choosing to offend. Ward himself addressed these issues in a sworn affidavit for his clemency proceedings, explaining that his learning disability and language impairments made it hard to express what he meant, and that his autism affected how others perceived him, causing them to misinterpret his remorse. He revealed that he wanted to say he was sorry, but the word felt fake to him, like people wouldn't believe it coming from him, which his attorneys argued demonstrated his awareness of his communication problems and his desire to be understood. Mental health experts explain that Ward's autism existed on a continuum where it wasn't severe enough to prevent functioning in society, but was significant enough to impair social functioning and emotional expression, making his psychological profile more complex than the simple psychopath label suggested. However, the prosecution maintained that Ward's diagnosis didn't change what he had done to Stacey Payne, pointing to the brutality, premeditation shown by attempting to cut phone lines, and the sexual assault as evidence of someone capable of planning and carrying out deliberate violence regardless of any challenges expressing remorse. Governor Braun reviewed the hearing record, the board's recommendation, and additional materials before announcing his decision on September 29, 2025, that clemency was denied and Ward's execution would proceed as scheduled on October 10th. Braun's statement emphasized that Ward's case had been reviewed by multiple courts over more than 2 decades without his sentence being overturned, noted the parole board's unanimous recommendation, and stated he saw no reason to override it, meaning Ward had exhausted all official avenues to avoid execution. On October 8th and 9th, Ward spent time with his spiritual advisor, Deacon Brian Nosbush. The visits provided Ward opportunity to discuss his spiritual state and prepare for death. Nosbush had worked with Ward for several years, building a relationship based on Ward's growing faith. Ward had become more religious during his time on death row, finding some comfort in belief even as his execution approached. Ward prepared a written statement he wanted Nosbush to read before the execution. The statement expressed remorse for what he had done to Stacey Payne and her family. Ward wrote that he wished he could undo his actions, that he hated himself for what he had done, and that he hoped his execution would bring the Payne family peace. The statement represented Ward's attempt to communicate feelings he struggled to express verbally. Ward's defense attorneys made final preparations. They ensured they would be present to witness the execution, both to support their client and to observe the procedure in case problems arose that might inform future challenges to Indiana's execution protocol. The attorneys had spent years working on Ward's case, and while they had failed to save his life, they wanted to be present for his final moments. The Payne family made their own preparations. They had waited more than 24 years for this day. Julie Payne had been told the execution would occur sometime after midnight on October 10th, before sunrise as required by Indiana law. The family chose not to attend the execution itself but would wait for confirmation that it had been carried out. Ward ordered his last meal on October 9th. He selected items from Texas Corral, a restaurant chain: a hamburger, steak melt, French fries, baked potato with butter, 12 fried shrimp, sweet potato, chicken Alfredo, and breadsticks. The meal reflected Ward's final opportunity to choose something for himself. Prison officials confirmed they would provide the meal during his final hours. The Indiana Department of Correction made final preparations at the state prison. The execution chamber was prepared. The pentobarbital was readied. Medical personnel who would insert the IV line and monitor Ward's vital signs reviewed their procedures. Correctional officers prepared for the movements required to bring Ward from his cell to the execution chamber at the appointed time. Governor Braun's office confirmed there would be no last-minute reprieve. The governor had denied clemency, and his position remained unchanged. Attorney General Todd Rokita's office confirmed the execution would proceed. All parties involved had done their parts. Courts had ruled, officials had decided, and the machinery of execution was ready to carry out the sentence. 2 juries had recommended. On the evening of October 9th, Ward made final phone calls to family members. His mother, now elderly, had moved to Michigan City years earlier to be close to her son. The calls were brief and emotional. Ward said goodbye to the few people who had maintained contact with him during his decades on death row. He knew these were his final conversations with anyone outside the prison. As midnight approached, Ward was moved from his death row cell to a holding area near the execution chamber. He changed into clean clothes provided by the prison. The process moved forward with the inevitability of procedures refined over decades. Barring a last-minute call from the Supreme Court, which Ward and his attorneys knew was unlikely, Roy Lee Ward would be dead before sunrise on October 10, 2025. At 12:01 a.m. Central Time on October 10, 2025, the clock marked the time when Indiana law permitted Roy Lee Ward's execution to begin. Outside Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, a small group of death penalty opponents gathered in a parking lot across from the facility. They held signs, prayed, and prepared to ring the Delaware bell, a practice borrowed from other executions to mark the passing of a human life. Inside the prison, Ward was led to the execution chamber. The room was clinical and purposeful, dominated by the gurney where condemned inmates spent their final minutes. Ward cooperated with corrections officers as they secured him to the gurney with restraints. The procedure had been practiced and refined over decades of executions in various states. Indiana's 15-year pause meant some officers were performing these duties for only the second or third time, but training ensured the process proceeded smoothly. Medical personnel inserted an IV line into Ward's arm. The line would deliver the pentobarbital that would kill him. Ward's witnesses, his attorneys and Deacon Nosbush, were escorted into the adjoining witness room. They could see Ward through a one-way glass window, but he couldn't see them clearly. The acoustic barrier meant they wouldn't hear his final words unless he spoke loudly. Nosbush had been granted permission to be in the execution chamber itself, an accommodation not always made for spiritual advisors. He stood near Ward, close enough to hold his hand, a final human connection in Ward's last moments. Nosbush later described this as important to Ward, who wanted physical contact with someone who cared about him as he died. Ward had prepared a written final statement that he wanted Deacon Brian Nosbush to read aloud during his final moments. His last words were officially recorded as, "Brian is going to read them." Ward was telling those present that Nosbush would read his prepared statement. However, the timing and circumstances of the execution process meant Nosbush never had the opportunity to read it aloud before the lethal injection began. Ward's carefully prepared words remained unspoken in the execution chamber. Hours later, his attorneys would share the full text of what Ward had written with the media and the public, revealing the remorseful message that never reached the ears of those witnessing his death. The execution process started shortly after midnight, according to official records. The exact timing of when pentobarbital entered Ward's system wasn't disclosed. Indiana keeps such details of its execution protocol confidential. What witnesses observed was Ward closing his eyes as the drug took effect. Nosbush held Ward's hand and watched for signs of distress. Nosbush later described what he witnessed. "He blinked at me just before. He closed his eyes. His hand that I was holding turned blue, and he was gone. There was no movement at all from the body." The description suggested a peaceful death, without the obvious distress some observers had reported during Ritchie's execution months earlier. The pentobarbital appeared to work as intended, rendering Ward unconscious quickly and stopping his breathing and heart function within minutes. The witnesses in the adjoining room could see Ward's form on the gurney, but couldn't observe details of his face or see the hand-holding between Ward and Nosbush. The attorneys noted in later statements that they had nothing unusual to report about what they observed, but acknowledged their view was limited by the window placement and distance. At 12:33 a.m., prison medical personnel confirmed Ward showed no heartbeat or respiration. The time of death was officially recorded as 12:33 a.m. Central Time. Roy Lee Ward had been alive for 53 years and was executed 24 years, 2 months, and 30 days after killing Stacey Payne. The execution had taken 32 minutes from the appointed start time to confirmed death. Outside the prison, the Delaware bell rang as word spread that the execution had been carried out. Bishop Robert McClory of the Diocese of Gary spoke to the small crowd of protesters, stating their opposition to capital punishment regardless of the crime committed. The gathering was quiet and respectful. Their protest was about principle, rather than defending Ward's actions. The Payne family issued no immediate statement. They had made their feelings clear during the clemency hearing and in previous public comments. The execution brought the closure they had sought for more than 2 decades. Though no execution could restore what they had lost when Ward killed Stacey. Ward's written final statement was released hours after his death. The full text read, "I wish I could go back and change things, but I can't. I hate myself for what I did. If I could take with me every bit of pain I have caused Stacey and her family, I would. There is no excuse. I also hurt my family. I wish I could take that away. I have asked God for forgiveness, even though I feel I do not deserve it and cannot forgive myself. I hope my execution gives Stacey's family some peace." The statement captured themes Ward's attorneys had emphasized: his remorse, his awareness of the harm he caused, and his hope that his death would bring some measure of peace to those he had hurt. Whether the Payne family found peace in Ward's execution remained private. No amount of remorse could undo what Ward had done, and no execution could bring Stacey back. Roy Lee Ward's execution was Indiana's 3rd since resuming capital punishment and the 2nd in 2025. Thank you for watching this comprehensive examination of the Roy Lee Ward case. This documentary represents extensive research into a legal proceeding that spanned 24 years and touched every level of the criminal justice system. If you found this presentation informative, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth true crime documentaries that prioritize factual accuracy and respectful coverage of these difficult cases. We encourage thoughtful discussion in the comments section.